First is that unequal cities will produce unequal participation, unequal social capital. So if we have cities that are different in their structure, in their morphologies, in their politics, then the type of citizenship or citizen engagement is bound to be different. My second point is that if you're not on the table, then you are part of the menu. Okay. So if you are, if community participation, and that's what we call it, so you can read it as citizen participation, but community participation is a very sexy thing to say. There is a lot of romanticism around it, but when you actually get down to doing community participation on the ground, I think there are a huge number of challenges. And I think one of the things that really makes it hard is that the intent to do this is actually missing. So just very quickly, what's CURE's interpretation? And for those of you who don't know CURE, we are the Center for Urban and Regional Excellence. We are a development NGO and headquartered out of Delhi, but working in several North Indian cities. Our core strength is working with slum communities. That's what we consider our home. So for us, our interpretation of community participation is, a group of people who may have shared roles, shared goals, shared interests, and who can take collective decisions to address their collective concerns. So if that, and to get there, it's not an easy path. It's not an easy road because it is a process. And that's what CURE recognizes very strongly, that participation is a process. You need to mine the local information. You need to create an enabling environment where informed choices can happen. You need to, harness or leverage the local resources, talents, ideas, networks, and liberate the energy that will be needed to spark all this local change. In fact, to build cities that we could say are future-proofed or resilient. Now, to do all this, what are some of the barriers? And that's the question of this particular panel, question to this particular panel. And I'm going to lay down 3 or 4 very, very critical challenges that we have for citizen participation that we have experienced from our work on the ground. I think, and a lot has been said right through the day, that there is a granularity in communities. Communities are much more nuanced, and therefore, the alignments, their relationships, their kinships, their networks, which go beyond religion and caste and class, they need to be explored. For at a neighborhood level, you could be, aligned to a money lender, or you could be aligned because of the reciprocity of some of these relationships. You could be aligned to some caregivers, and even though you may be in the same geography, you would still be very, very differently aligned, and that makes the choices that people take, this complexity, this footwork that we see in the community, that makes it much, much harder to deal with. Just going back to what was said in the previous session at the very end, which was the comparison between Bangalore and Chennai. I think if you look at comparisons between and across cities, some of the bigger cities, the metro cities, are much more complex. But when we go down to, say, cities like Agra, where we've been working, or even a city like Bhubaneswar, or say Gangtok, these cities are far less complicated. There is a shared common sense, quote unquote, there's a shared culture that the residents of these people have. And these are probably because these cities are not growing as fast as metros are, or do not have a diversity of occupations that attract some of the migrants. But the challenges of working in some of these cities are less as compared to what we would see in cities like Delhi, what we would see in cities like Mumbai, Bangalore, etc. So if unequal cities are producing unequal social capital, we have to understand that there is a lot of gatekeeping that happens. And on my drive into Bangalore yesterday, there was a proud billboard that was displaying a gated community on offer. It was real estate, and it was in your face that we are offering you a gated community. So we are actually, in the kind of developmental model that we are adopting in some of these cities, we are actually creating the exclusion by the real estate-led development model. So in this kind of scenario where you are fenced out because you are perhaps a landless person, as somebody mentioned in the morning, that there is a distinction between renters and owners of home spaces. There are those who have identity cards and who don't have identity cards. There are people who are informal and formal, depending upon the kind of work that these people are doing. So these cities, because of these differences, becoming an insider in some of these conversations that we talk about in citizen participation become very, very hard to manage. And from here, my point is that informality in the city, land tenure is one, and informality in the city, that is the fact that you may or may not have the identity cards that would enable you to access various services. I think that deepens you, it pushes down you down the ladder, makes you even more unaccounted for, it makes you even more invisible. And I think this is something that we have not really factored in our access to citizenship, in our practice of citizenship, because these are small things in the system that actually prevent or discourage. Let me put it like that, not prevent as much as discourage some of the poor people to come forward. The land and the temporariness of the living arrangement that some of these poor people live in, and the fear of being evicted actually makes them, keeps their mouth shut. Because if you're going to come out openly, and then suddenly the city sees you, hey, there's an illegal settlement right under our nose, let's move it out. It's real estate-led development. Let's accept it. It's private sector real estate-led development. And if you see some prime property occupied by the poor people in the city somewhere, in the heart of the city, you're going to have, eyeballs which would try and, displace some of these. In fact, if you look at the affordable housing model that's coming out, which is probably the new avatar of the Rajiv Awas Yojana, it's actually going to ring fence the cities, and it's going to shift all the poor out of the slums and drive them onto the fringes of the city. So we're going to have a dual city where the core is going to be elite capture, and the outside or the peri-urban is going to be people who are providing us with those services. So what, apart from this, there are a very strong institutional barriers that prevent us from creating these platforms of engagement. Now, what are these institutional barriers? What are these systems? One, we may talk about capacity. We normally, that's the cliched argument that institutions or local government officials do not have the capacity. To a certain extent, this is true, but I'm beginning to discover that some of our local engineers, our street engineers, are actually much smarter than some of the engineers that you may find outside the system, because they exactly know where to connect. And I think it's not about capacity, but more a fear of the system that prevents these engineers or any bureaucrats from taking and you could see that very clearly in the previous speaker. She wasn't able to answer your question because there is a fear of the system, and the system is very hard. It's very inflexible. Even though in Delhi we've been trying to build these alternate decentralized models of sanitation, which will enable urban slum dwellers to have their own home toilets. Now, I think the challenge is very doable within the kind of small spaces and within the kind of temporary arrangements. It is possible to create these systems, but the system doesn't allow us to do that, because every time you actually start digging the ground, you have a whole series of problems, even when the poor people are willing to invest in their own services. So there is this systemic, rigidity which we need to. Do I have time? 2 more minutes. Okay, so I'm going to run through it very quickly and to make 2 or 3 more points. One is that there is a hypocrisy of citizenship. And there is, if we put it against the Einstein's ladder of community participation, and I think that's something I think the study may want to do, is to do that, match between the non-participation to real participation, and to see at what levels does the citizenship, or vertical and horizontal, what are the kind of relationships that they have. Hypocrisy in the sense that even an agreement to a local politician, a local politician come and say, hey, this is what I'm going to do to your area. And we nod our head. We conclude that this is citizen participation, but that's not real participation. And so therefore there is a hypocrisy around this. The other point is that when we do real participation, we are curating a lot of diverse ideas from the bottom. So each slum will have a different plan, each slum will have a different need, each slum group of people would have a different requirement. So what do we do in this kind of a context? How does a government, and I don't blame some of our bureaucrats for not being able to bundle all this together, because they are used to doing grand schemes. So for them, it doesn't make sense to do one community toilet that is customized to that one house, which is what we NGOs want. So, but what they are interested in doing is, can we put 10,000 toilets together, put a DPR, put a cost to it, and have a plan, and then bid it out to the lowest tender or the bidder. So there is diversity. And this is, makes it much more complicated, and there are, it makes it, and I think the other two quick points. One is about the scale, and I think Ramesh mentioned it earlier in this previous session. It's about scaling up citizen partnership. Can we imagine doing participation at scale? I don't know how many slums there are in Bangalore, but Delhi has about 686 as per the, incidentally, the slum population is beginning to slow down. I think some study would be useful to see, because I think city governments are beginning to protect their spaces, and therefore there are no spaces for the poor to now so this is telling me to get off the mic. Okay. All right, and finally, working on scale, I think there would always be a glass ceiling. There's a glass ceiling because even organizations like us who believe in the reality of participation actually would not share everything with the community, because we fear that there could be these vested interests and groups that could develop. So I'm going to stop here. And then,
I'm going to do two things. One is to talk about, that's the second slide, to talk about the urban ethnography that I have been doing as a part of the ESRC, the European Social Research Council grant on explaining electoral change in urban and rural India. That's a networking grant of which Janaagraha is also a part. So that ethnography is done in urban Delhi in Sangam Vihar. And then what I do is, we've written up a considerable amount on the findings or the ethnographic engagement, as I would like to say, on Sangam Vihar itself. And then what I do is that I use some of the imaginaries that come from this ethnography and go to another site and I begin to think about Patna. So there is a sense in which I engage with the urban periphery, which is land on the margins of the city of Delhi. And these are essentially segregated settlements of the urban poor, herded in zones of illegality, really. I can't really say they're all poor, but definitely all herded in zones of illegality. And they're the other important way in which they are herded together or looked at as the other from the outside world of Delhi is that they're outside the perimeter of urbanized services. So very similar to Jimmy Holston's Sao Paulo, so to say. Now there is, in this whole description of the periphery, there is a notion of the center. And in Delhi, the center is the imaginary of the imperial sites of power. That's the urban utopia, so to say. And if you engage with people over an extended point of time, the ideas in the urban periphery, the engagement ideas, or even the complaints about exclusion is articulated as voice, as grievance, and very strong voices of grievance are really demands to be inserted back into the city. The center remains the parameter or the horizon within which the utopia itself can be demanded by citizens that remain on the periphery of the territory of the city. So here, issues of participation appear as if they are those of the marginal citizens and their relationship to the city. It's the city and the citizen, and the citizen wanting to insert this segregated piece of land back into the city and asserting their right to city in this manner. Now then this notion of urban periphery is extended to a national scale, to a place called Patna, which is the capital of Bihar. And I then analyze visuals from this city, the second city, which is Patna, and which is low on all the substantive as well as the aesthetic measures of the urban. These are comparative reflections on Patna urban then. So there are two substantive engagements and some methodological reflections coming from engagement with two forms of urban periphery. Now, the Sangam Vihar story really, you can skip the second slide and go on to the third one. So this is really thinking about cities in a context-embedded way, thinking about a comparative political sociology of urban marginality, and thinking about cities in a manner in which history and politics seem to matter. We don't simply brush aside the history that the city has had or the political engagements that define the city in the way it exists today. Now these, I think, are important in understanding the political and civic participation towards urban change and towards understanding the cities as they exist in India. Now, coming to Sangam Vihar is really south of South Delhi, foothills of the Aravalli, and the ruins of Tughlakabad fort, which was built by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a ruler whom a lot of you may know wanted to shift the capital city out of Delhi, a ruler who was known in Delhi itself as one of those with a heightened focus on political power. And in a very classic sense, as I engage with Sangam Vihar, I find that Sangam Vihar, or indeed large parts of the urban periphery in Delhi, live with the same public choice dilemma or public policy dilemma that it was at the time of Tughlaq. A ruler engaged too much with the pursuit of political power and building citadels of political power. And the city also had a people's saint in Nizamuddin, who was at the same time as Muhammad bin Tughlaq was building up his fort. This saint was none other, he was a saint not because he was a master of the scriptures, but he had a workfare policy. People who went to build the fort by the day were building a step well or a water well or a bauli by night, and he became the saint of the people. In many ways, he still remains a patron saint or saint of the underclass in the city. So that's the city as it remains even today, a center of political power. Its buildings represent the grandeurs of political power and the centrality of that power. Its people in much need of workfare, of support, and indeed of water. So Sangam Vihar is really a place where the government denies that it exists. it says this is forest. And till date, official maps of the government describe Sangam Vihar even on testimony to the court as open degraded forest. So the official maps describe it, paint the place as somewhat green and phasing off to a deserty color of the forest itself. In real life, however, there are 2.5 lakh people who live here. There are 24 polling stations and many other types of government engagement that would literally nail the lie of the government. Now, the barriers to civicness in Sangam Vihar come, as I see it, from the conflation of two forms of hierarchy, the hierarchy of Manu and that of Weber. Now, there are interesting ways in which the Weberian hierarchy indeed wears the robe of Manu, and that is what I see as the practice of discriminatory citizenship. And these are explained or practiced as a form of distance that is expressed on the pollution purity scale, and they inform the practices of discrimination, build our sensibilities of what we need to hate. Therefore, the barriers, effective barriers to citizenship, if they can be cited from Sangam Vihar, begin from how we discriminate. The first barrier is a visual barrier. The next one, there is a huge garbage heap, nearly half a square kilometer, that differentiates Sangam Vihar from its neighboring, very rich but also unauthorized area called Sanic Farms. So the visual, in a sense, is a barrier, the huge garbage dump. The second barrier, obviously, is the stench that comes from the garbage dump. So in understanding urban marginality, therefore, on the categorical variables that we have understood until now, in the practiced form of citizenship, the visual of a dirt heap being piled on to those who are to be herded off in zones of illegality. Remember, those who treat these problems only as things that are resultant from the master plan of Delhi, or because of the method in which the master plan was made, or even talking about things like, oh, this is off the map of Delhi, doesn't tell us enough about how the discrimination itself is practiced. It's actually practiced daily by putting a huge garbage dump, and it smells so much that you just don't go anywhere near. And you understand the people who may be living inside the areas, people living inside a herded zone. So what would the citizens who live inside think of their difference from the city that's very close to them yet very far from them? Now, government officers who deal with Sangam Vihar, as well as the residents who live there, use one term iteratively. Bahut zyada badbu hai. There is too much smell, and that's what differentiates us. And people almost accept that if we are from Sangam, please excuse us, there is too much stench in the place that we live in. Now, this is something that comes from across. Sangam Vihar within the area also has subzones. Muslims live in areas that are demarcated for them. There is, in the works that I've published until now, there's some description of the geography within Sangam Vihar. There is the K block, that's also referred to as the Bakri Gali. Now, when I was interviewing young girls, telling them that there are so many government-funded high schools and colleges, and why a lot of them don't attend college, I still remember, and that's one of the papers that I've done, when Nuzrabad comes back and tells me that if we go to college, it means inviting friends over. And then I'm explained that during the rainy months, the drainage, which is nothing else but their collective efforts to be able to somehow dispose their dirt, because the government does not recognize that it exists as a colony, therefore does nothing to either supply water or take their excreta away. So each one of them are responsible for every millimeter of input as well as every millimeter of output that they have. Now the young girl tells me that what if one of my friends wants to come back to my house? In the rainy season, the backflow is so much. Our house is just like yours. We have a fridge, we have a television, we have a sofa set, but in the rainy season, we have to put all of this on top of the chowki that we have in our house. Our house stinks. However, can I ever invite my friends over? So stench is a marker, a distinguishing mark of the life that you live here. And that's really a very serious, tangible barrier to participation. Now the L block first gully, which largely has a very smooth kind of population of other backward castes, women, for example, tell us they never accept that the place that they live in is dirty, but they often, when they're walking out of their houses, they will tell us, can't you see, we've kept our houses clean on the inside, can't you see the outside? It's the open drains, can the Sarkar not do anything about it? And these were the women who would often signal to me, pointing out Didi, when I was speaking to them before the assembly elections, pointing to me, look out towards the jhadu. So this was a signal, therefore, that amongst all types of communities within Sangam Vihar, the one important thing that was preventing their participation or their embrace by the world outside was really the fact that they lived in this differentiated space, differentiated geography on which there were identifiable markers of discrimination. The next one, please. Now, as I said, Sangam Vihar is not a social monolith, and these are the second and third sets of barriers that I will come to. Now, it's very common to say that we are internally differentiated and religion and caste are markers, but look at what it means inside Sangam Vihar. The Jats, Gujars, and the Muslims perceive themselves to be enemies of each other. And each one of them tells us stories that date back to the 15th century. The Muslims say, ये ज़मीन तो हमारी थी, कभी हमारे बाप दादा यहाँ रहते थे, वो पाकिस्तान चले गए, उसके बाद यहाँ जाट गुजर का राज हुआ. Now Jat Gujars have another history that they believe in. They say this land was theirs and they own this land, and in fact they've carved out what they call the colony. Now this is an unauthorized colony, 2.5 million people living here, 2.5 lakh people living here, and each one of them claiming tenuous rights over the households that they stay in. Now the Muslim ilakas are separate, as I told you, but the Muslim ilakas are also to be found in lumpy nodules as you walk across the main gullies of Sangam Vihar. So as you walk across, iteratively, as you walk across the main gully, which is the L block gully of Sangam Vihar, you find that next to a mosque or next to a meat shop, there will be 4 or 5 shops and maybe a couple of households that are the Muslims. So either they say segregated within Sangam Vihar, within designated areas which are their own, where a mosque is supposed to be in command of the water that is supplied in an unauthorized sort of way from borewells that are either privately captured or by the government handing over the power and control of the borewells to the mosque itself. Or when they stay in areas where there's a mixed Hindu and Muslim population, they tend to stay lumped together. So you begin to understand the geography of Sangam Vihar as an uneven geography marked by some amount of, I don't know whether to call it ethnic enclaves or ghettos, but I would rather say that they are more like ghettos than enclaves. The Muslim ilakas seem somewhat like enclaves, but I would think, looking at some other caste ghettos, that they're more like ghettos. Now, there is one more segregation that I'll come to, which is the caste-based segregation. On the next slide, let me concentrate here on the further exclusion or the further barriers that Muslims face. Now, we would like to believe that the voter card is something that has been universally distributed. Oh, don't even talk to us about this. We know people have their voter cards. Look at their high turnouts. Now, when you repeatedly visit Sangam Vihar, Muslims complain about the fact that Jats, as they call it, Jat Gujar ke Londe, which means the young ones of the Jat and Gujar repeatedly tear up the epic cards, and recent Muslim migrants have often been denied voter cards in large numbers. But they are very, very soft when they complain about it, and you gather the complaints only after a relationship has been established. In fact, they don't want to tell you about the complaint and often ask the researcher, are you going to write our name in a register? No, I'm not going to write your name in a register. I'm only a university professor. Look at my students. No, if you write our names in a register, we are going to be sent back from here to Uttar Pradesh. So only after much confidence has been gained do Muslims come up and they accept the fact that their epic cards have been torn and thrown away. Now, on women, there's a different form of exclusion. Women confide that their families have just not allowed the voter cards to have been made. Now, there may be a case that their voter cards exist, but it's not with them, it's somewhere else. But there is some amount of evidence to the fact, the next one, that Muslims have been excluded from participating in the electoral arena. Now, a further discrimination can be seen amongst what are called the Valmikis, the Valmiki community, a scheduled caste community, supposed to have a strong marker of identity, believe in the Valmiki. Now they are, even in Sangam Vihar, which is an unauthorized colony where the houses people live in are on insecure forms of tenure, and most of them bought off Jat and Gujar landowners without any form of security of the right to property. Now even here, the Valmikis stay hidden from public view. And we discovered the Valmikis only after many visits to Sangam Vihar, to the left of the main L block gully, and further down the neem tree, herded in 3 to 4 gullies, or sub-gullies as we call it in our larger write-ups. So the Valmikis stayed to the left of the main gullies, hidden behind the neem tree, and only in 3 or 4 gullies. And in those 3 or 4 gullies, no other castes or Muslims build their houses together with the Valmikis. Now, the Valmikis are a politically empowered group. They also have very, very strong networks with political parties and the powerful outside. Many of them, there's an old lady that we often interview there, and she talks about her engagement with the city of Delhi. She says that she came to the city in the ilaka of Teen Murti. So she's among those few in Sangam Vihar who's actually seen and lived in central Delhi. And she says, "Hum Gandhi's Nehru ke zamane mein aaye." So even iterating talks about the Congress, or talking about, can we skip a couple of slides and just, okay. So the 9th one maybe. So even then, even though they seem to have very strong connections with the center of power, those conditions, those connections are not enough to alter the conditions of sub-segregation with which they live in Sangam Vihar. And the rest of Sangam Vihar seems to live with a sense of order. And when you speak to them about Valmikis living only in 3 or 4 gullies, they tell you, yeah, they're nice people. वो अपने ही इलाके में रहते हैं. Which means that their staying in those 3-4 gullies is something that has given the whole geography a semblance of social order. So when I look at Sangam Vihar, I say Weber matters, and we can come back to this point if we have time. Now, in contrast, I now reflect on Patna. And now, this city has a center, and that center is called the Gandhi Maidan. This center, unlike in Delhi, where the center is a site of imperial power, the city center in Patna has been the site of protest. Jayaprakash Narayan, Karpuri Thakur, all of them made their very effective anti-emergency speeches here. And I've also seen the Garib rallies of Lalu Prasad Yadav. The state has had a quarter of a century of rule by regional parties in the name of social justice. And this quarter of a century of rule, as also preceding historical acts of partition of Bihar from Bengal and later from Orissa, has meant that a lot of the overlords, a lot of the patrons from the patron-client relationship have actually been effectively driven away from the states. Hordes of Muslim elites, hordes of Bengalis and Kayasthas, those who could have held the thread literally of Renaissance or thought-led, idea-led revolution in the state, actually defected the place. Now what do I see, the last slide, what do I see Gandhi Maidan today as? Now at 6 a.m. in the morning, the city center is a symbol of distress, of distress, of those who've migrated to the city because they've not been able to take the train to anywhere. So those who are literally taking the train to anywhere, those who have able-bodied bodies have migrated to Pune, to Surat, to Pimpri Chinchwad, and amongst the large middle class that's causing the civicness in Bangalore, they have migrated to Delhi or to Bangalore in pursuit of education. So those who are not able-bodied enough and do not have enough to be able to even sell off labor power of their bodies are sprawled around the city and selling things like twigs from the forest and pretending that's the toothbrush that you could use for a good morning sunshine toothbrush moment that you can have. Or they're simply selling things like roasted grains or boiled eggs. And the urban sprawl is such that every 5 steps you can find somebody trying to just sell the same stuff over and over again. And then you realize, then I tread on to what is the Ashok Rajpath, and I compare the Ashok Rajpath to what is the Shantipath in Delhi, and I find the 2 sides of Ashok Rajpath are effectively used for the urban sprawl that I saw in Gandhi Maidan, as also as public urinals. The city is infested with mosquitoes. The city has no way to be able to dispose its garbage. Its civic bodies, the mayor and the CEO, are locked in a dispute. They wouldn't listen to the sovereign in Patna. For them, it's a territorial non-entity. And I was in Patna last week, and I was just trying to tell myself that am I overreacting to the city that belongs to me? I wasn't, because that day I saw, that night in fact, the chief minister suspended the IAS officer. He decided the dispute between the elected mayor and the CEO, who was an Indian Administrative Service officer, by suspending the IAS officer. Now the reasons given for the suspension of the IAS officer were that he's not been able to dispose the urban garbage, he's not been able to buy the defogging machine, but the mayor of Patna was an elected social justice mayor. He belonged to the minority community. Politically, it was safe, therefore, to have the mayor on and dismiss the CEO. So that's the cost that the urban marginals and the distressed poor who've migrated to Patna, which, they, in a sense, they constitute the idea of India. In a sense, they constitute, national discourses on how inequality and marginality should be at the center of the social justice discourse of the nation. But look at what they constitute for themselves: a city that doesn't have its own citizens, a city that is abandoned, a city that is more a symbol of urban distress and may therefore come up at the bottom of any continuum that's made up of more smoothened indices, however sensitive they are to the differences that we have. So the challenges that we have are really looking at context embeddedness in a certain sort of way, but also reflecting comparatively and making governments work. It may be said that it's so good for the poor. The right to the city really means that the poor drive away anybody who was ever called a patron. But if you look at the story of Patna, you realize that the missing middle may be the story of urban renewal for Patna.
I just would like to add one small input before we open it up for discussion. Having discussed the citizenship index, I thought I'll just bring one more data in which could put issues in perspective. This is a data I want to share on citizen participation in range of political activities, which is drawn from the National Election Study of 2014. In this National Election Study of 2014, we tried to tap the intensity of political participation of citizens, and this was other than voting. We used 5 dimensions to tap it. Your participation in political rallies and processions, your participation in election meetings, door-to-door campaigns, your participation in the distribution of leaflets, and your participation in helping parties raise funds. And if you look at the index of participation, there are certain interesting indicators that come in. If you look at the level of high participation, and we have defined high participation here as those who took part in 4 or more than 4 of these activities. If you look at high participation, there is actually no difference between urban India and rural India. There are marginal differences with a little higher participation in rural India when we come to those who say they have taken part in 1 or 2 of these events. But when you look at high participation, rural and urban India does not differ. And if you look at urban India exclusively, there is no class difference between the poor, the middle class, and the upper class. The middle class and the upper class may have registered a little more yes when it came to participation in 1 or 2 events. And finally, we also did not find any significant caste difference in terms of high participation, save in the case of the dominant backward castes in different regions who expressed a little higher participation when it came to 2 or 3 of the activities. So when you come to high participation, urban-rural divide does not seem to exist. A divide in terms of class does not seem to exist. And the divide in terms of caste only seems to be in terms of a little higher level of participation when it comes to the dominant caste in that particular region. I thought I would just flag this issue before opening it up for discussion.
In Sangam Vihar, in Patna, and in Agra, and in Savda Kevla, right? If you went ahead and administered the citizenship index kind of instrument on knowledge and participation, what is your sense of what those numbers would look like? Would they look similar to what you have here? Because, I mean, the reason I'm asking is because of 2 kinds of structures. One is, it's evident from people who work in Bangalore and these cities that on this whole notion of the basic service delivery index. And many of Bangalore's informal settlements will do much better than Sangam Vihar. Many of the others would do much better than the formal resettlement colony like Savda Kevra. And yet, if I look at Patna and Agra, I'm not so sure it'll do that badly in terms of just pure housing type, condition, and the kinds of services. Electricity is an issue, but otherwise it's true. So, do these relationships which are being tried by Siddharth, Ashu, Ebony, and Patrick on relating citizenship and basic service deliveries, etc., do these things break down somewhere in the places where you're working? And if so, what do you think are the processes that are driving that stuff?
Actually, surprisingly enough, the answer to both your questions would be A, in terms of the results of the index, and B, in terms of the policy that must be in place. And of course, I would say that in terms of the results of the index, I can already see that there will be a variety of results that will come in, and Patna will give you surprising results. Therefore, it's far more advisable to do a far stronger ethnography. Also to understand whether cities in the nation, I mean, Delhi is a typical example of the city actually preceding the nation, the city inserting itself into the history of the nation. Patna being one of those cities that's been created by certain acts since its division from, or its partition, twofold partition from Bengal. It seems the urban governance has never been able to recover. And at least there are two institutions that have never been able to recover from this, from the effects of this type of public policy measure. So Patna is a city that's contributed a lot more to the life of the nation. The utopia, you know, almost every wall would have had, if longitudinal surveys were done, would have had writing saying, Chalo, Delhi, Chalo. So for Patna, the utopia never was, or for rural areas around it, the utopia never was, Chalo, Patna, Chalo. So the state really never had Patna as the center of its imagination, in a sense that Delhi was its imagination. Now when you land in Delhi, you get herded into zones of illegality because your resources are never enough to get off the third class compartment of the train and to get onto a legal zone of Delhi. And that's what begins the politics of the Purvanchalis. You know, prior to the 90s, I had not even heard of the term, but I realized that large parts of my fellow people who were migrating from my state or from other reasons were being known as Purvanchalis in Delhi. So Patna, in a sense, contributed to the nation, wasn't really a city on its own, though Narendra and I have had some power on this. He said, oh, Patliputra, etc. But I'm looking at it from the colonial times and I can see that it's a city that's never really been on its own and doesn't really hold the imagination of the state. That besides the point, the lack of provision of services is such that it's flimsily hidden in the name of there being a secular government in the state of Patna, which is upholding a secular government in the center. And I think that charade has finally come apart. In a sense, people are not yet articulating, but they understand that services are the poor. And even the poorest who've been to a Pimpri Chinchwad or a Surat or a Pune are understanding that what they have in Patna is something which is appalling. I mean, in one of the university sites, we were having a meeting of a rights group, and activists who had been with the peasant movement in the 90s said that, does it even look like a college? Banks of the Ganges, a beautiful historical building. JP was educated in that college. Premchand had been there. All the big ones have been there or been its alumni. 2 foreign secretaries, 1 cabinet minister of India, all of them come from there. And here's a Dalit activist telling me, doesn't even look like a college. And then you begin to ask Dalit activists, what is it? Then he can comparatively reflect on what the basic services are, and even in Pimpri Chinchwad or a Pune and a Surat. So there is, in a sense, a comparative reflection that's building up somewhat the aspiration that this should be different, but it's not an assertion of a right in the sense in which Sangam Vihar, which is just experienced, I would say, its insurgent moment when it voted with its feet down for the AAP party. So in a sense, I don't see that the weight of collective action is not such that it can transform Patna. It doesn't hold the imagination of its citizens, and the middle that could in fact hold it. So I would say the results would be very, very different for Patna. Anybody who's staying there is a person who's not been able to take the train to anywhere or the flight out to anywhere. I mean, it's amazing. You get down at the airport and the number of people queuing up outside to just receive a loved one. This is not the railway station. At the airport, which is a small airport, and I regularly visit many small airports in the country, I have not seen such a phenomenal turnout to see a loved one off at the airport. So it's a deserted state, so to say. So I would say the results would be very, very different. For the public policy part, I would say somehow build pressure even on those state governments that rule in the name of social justice to be able to just give the basics. I mean, the right to water, the right to a urinal, the right to live in a mosquito-free city, the right to live without garbage cheek by jowl drowning you. Otherwise, it's just going to be an urban ruin, an archaeological site, even while we live and breathe around it. So these are outliers. These are very, very different. And political participation or political sloganeering is not enough. Therefore, I do think the basic services index that you have is a very, very effective instrument of at least talking about or sparking the debate on suburbanism. And I do think there's a lot of merit in that index that you've built. The moment you transport yourself and translocate yourself with that index, not just the comparative merit, but its potential to be able to spark the debate or the argument around it might be the starting of a debate on the right to the city or the imagination of the city.
I just add a few points to that. Just taking off from what Manisha said right in the end, that the citizenship index may actually provide you with a differential number. To my mind, I think the maths is not as easy or as linear, because you can arrive at 4 in several different ways. So if your participation index says 32%, in say a city like Bangalore, and then maybe I think Patna would be worse, but if it gives you the same figure, I think the dynamics behind that may be completely different. It could be coming from various sources, the engagement or the lack of it. Now let me look at the 2 or 3 things that you identified, Partha. If you look at something like a resettlement colony, which is 10,000 households evicted from the city, all in one common geography, facing the same kind of issues, same kind of problems, their participation was much higher at the time of relocation. But over the years, as there was a strong political will to make that thing work, services moved in to not the desirable extent, but to a certain extent that enabled people to live there well enough, and an economy of that particular sub-city has grown. So therefore, what I've seen is a kind of a relationship where I've seen the engagement actually, kind of dip, perhaps in something which is more inner city area where we are working now. Because there is an issue around which people are galvanized, the citizen engagement it will be at a much higher level. So at whatever point you enter that particular community, if there is an event that is proceeding or happening at that moment, I think that's good. That's really going to determine what your data is going to throw up. And if you look at something like Agra, everyone has the same level of services across the city. So therefore, there is no, contest in that sense between the have-nots and those who are the richer people. So when there is no contest, and also because the city is so disempowered, the smaller your city are, the further you are from the seat of power, the less control you have over your resources and your solutions and your choices. So you probably don't find a very high level of citizen engagement, only because, as somebody mentioned in the morning, there is a hopelessness, or there is a sense of, well, we're not really going to get what we are really, aspiring for.
So the Valmikis, who are politically well connected and networked, still kind of stay in those very poor conditions in Sangam Vihar, And second, those individuals in Sainik farms who put up with all the garbage without having the ability or without having that removed, despite being politically connected. Why do you think that is? What explanation do you think can be offered for those kind of seemingly contradictory, a group being politically connected yet kind of being ghettoized, and another group which is also very wealthy and presumably politically connected, having to put up with this stench and a huge garbage dump outside their presumably very wealthy surroundings?
Indians need to construct the statue, we like the deity worship. So we don't just live with the idea of the Gini coefficient, we need to see it, we need to have it. So Sainik Farms is the rich unauthorized colony, and it throws all its dump. It's a very rich colony. It has no power connection, no water connection, but each house has probably a swimming pool of its own and a power generator set of its own. So what it does is effectively in its backyard, it creates a garbage dump which is the size of 1/4 of Sangam Vihar. So nearly an area which is half a square kilometer is the garbage dump of Sainik Farms. Now Sainik Farms is also an unauthorized colony. The manner in which it differentiates itself, and I can tell you, when I'm going to Sangam Vihar from Sainik Farms, I don't see the difference. Every time I come back from Sangam Vihar to Sainik Farms, just having spent the first part of the day. Now in this fieldwork, let me tell you, the stench is such that despite over 8 months of fieldwork, I am never able to stay in the area for beyond lunch hours. By 2 I have to be back. But when I'm coming back, then I can see the visual of difference, of an urban life. So it's not Sainik Farms, pardon me if there's a mistake there, if I have communicated it that way, but Sainik Farms distinguishes itself as the upper class, in relation to the underclass. Oh, my driver stays there. Now you don't look back because that's an area that stinks. So you don't need to travel the distance. And people like me who actually travel the distance are not really, why do you need to, you can send some researchers, but why do you need to dirty your hands on your own? And just because I've been to an area where there is bad stench of everything, and this is not simply a statement of the problem or problem mongering. In the Valmiki colony, the problem that I state is that there's further sub-ghettoization. Even within Sangam Vihar, which is a ghetto of its own, the informal boundaries are marked by the garbage dump. Even within Sangam Vihar, you discover the Valmikis only at the end of what is called L block. Now, any citizen of Sangam Vihar describes themselves to various markers of identity. The L block or the main gully is one of those proud things. Oh, I am so much further from the main gully. Or weekly markets or haats. And in relation to the spot of the weekly market or hut, they describe their residence. Now, what they've effectively done, the Jats and the Gujars, who are called the builders or the colonizers, property dealers as what they're referred to in the colony, have made sure that the Valmikis get their plots only in 2 or 3 gullies. And the Valmikis also don't break this social order. They don't buy a plot outside of this. As of date, I have not discovered even one Valmiki household outside of these 3 or 4 gullies. Now, in these 3 or 4 gullies, of the Safai Karamcharis that are provided by the state, even the Safai Karamcharis refuse to go and clean the area. Now, the men would report to me and say, they would often tell me that the Safai Karamcharis don't come here, but the men would say, oh, we have hired a private cleaner by paying of our own. On repeated visits, the women disclosed it all and said, oh, when the men are away, we just pick up the brooms on our own and we clean this. So cleaning garbage outside your house. So this is the pollution purity norm, Keep the Valmikis there, treat them as equal people. There's a third site of civicness that I couldn't discuss with you today because of lack of time. That's the site of the elite. That's the Jat Dharamshala where I've captured some social activity within Sangam Vihar. Now in the Jat Dharamshala, when there are meetings before elections, representatives of Valmikis are invited. And at the time of the elections, wedding type revelry goes on in the Jat Dharamshala room, and the Valmikis are served a tray with lots of food to eat, colored cold drinks. It's almost like a North Indian wedding that goes on. But beyond the electoral time and beyond the arena of the electoral, you will not have anything to do with them. So the election time is really a suspended moment in the ordinary life of Sangam Vihar, which is why you have questions that say, oh, very high participation because it's an extraordinary time. You've suspended normal relationships which are built strictly on pollution purity, even if there is no ritual ground or traditional ground, you have built new ones. For example, the manner in which garbage or stench is used. In Valmiki Vihar colony, for example, when I go for my fieldwork, everywhere you are offered water. If you don't have that first sip, they don't want to even deal with you. They're testing you if you have that water or not. Now, having water in Sangam Vihar, it's a very tricky situation. So I often tell them, get me tea. Now, get me tea. While my tea is down on the street floor and I'm sitting on a chair and taking down my field notes while Amma is talking about something, when I pick up my cup for the next sip, there are about 20 flies dead in that cup. So that's stench. Now, it is daily lived. Stench is a very important thing in dealing with the urban periphery or the urban marginal, in a sense in which Gautam Bhan's term of planned illegality or Ananya Roy's term about fallen off the map, these don't strictly describe what you get to see there. So this is a manner in which, now if you ask the government officers, they will say, oh, in Sangam Vihar, Badmash log stay in Sangam Vihar. So all the residents of Sangam Vihar are described as Badmash log. So between the state and the people, no civil relationships are possible. This is what prevents them from coming into the universal embrace of citizenship. First order is that you remove the barriers between the state and the citizen, remove the purity pollution norms. The state officials should not be calling them Badmash log as if they can be dealt with only through criminal instrumentalities available with the state and no forms of civil engagement between the state and the people.
As a former Dilliwala, I'm a little puzzled by what you said. And I'm trying to imagine, I know Sainik Farms very well, I'm trying to imagine how you would create the largest garbage dump of Delhi. And, or one of the largest. But if the dump exists, then the stench would come to you as well at some point. And one can say that there are a lot of Sainik farmhouses which have air conditioning, and so you can close yourself up, but they also take pride in sitting on their lawns. So how do you keep the stench off from Sainik Farms if it's next door, if it's the one that is separating Sangam Vihar and Sainik Farms?
Answer to that is that Sainik Farms tapers off towards the end and the area becomes Nebsarai Thana. So the Sainik Farms actually ends about half a kilometer before the garbage dump. So Sainik Farm trails off. Then there's the Nebsarai. So Nebsarai effectively holds the Badmash log inside in that zone. And after the Thana trails off and after you've crossed the Nala, then you have the garbage dump. And just by the side of the garbage dump, you find that Sangam Vihar has restored its sanity. It's all disorder inside, but outside there is a large sign that says, Block A Sangam Vihar Resident Welfare Association welcomes you. And then you have a couple of private schools that go on. I often feel that those private schools were strategically planted by the colonies on the side so that there is actually a physical buffer between here and there. So there is a buffer zone, but imaginatively speaking, it's the garbage dump that separates visually Sainik Farms from this place to that. And sure, Sainik Farms, and what happens in Sangam Vihar, for example, there's no way that the city that doesn't pay for its externalities. I mean, I could assure you that the open nalas or the drains or the lack of facilities to be able to expose of their excreta are the cause of a lot of vector-borne diseases that we do see in the city, but the city regularly under-reports on public health issues, largely to mask the problems that are festering underneath.
Underlying the kinds of survey questions that you asked. So for instance, how do we put these two together, right? Or can we? What you're mentioning and these kinds of questions. It seems to me that the kinds of survey questions that were asked, which no doubt painted an important picture, do not ask about the salience of the questions being asked. So if I were somebody living there, and you ask me, do I get this service, that service? It's not a question which maybe makes sense or is particularly interesting. It is not salient to me. I might or might not answer, which is what I think Manisha's answer to Partha was. I don't know, that maybe you will get the same kind of survey answers or different. Because it seems to me that the salience is of such a different category that the same questions will not make the same sense. And therefore, from a comparative perspective, answers of that sort are incomparable. So you might get answers. You'll have all your categorical variables, right? People might say something or not, but that's not what's motivating them. I mean, so I think I think it does speak to the limits of methodological individualism embedded in surveys, which cannot ask about the salience of the questions being asked.